What's good? Osiris here. Stuck in the middle. Alternate channel. I am going to play. When I saw this happened this past weekend, almost a week ago now. Steve Bannon. Steve Bannon raising. Step your game up, Bannon. He is. He did. Steve Bannon, for real. I've never heard him say this before. He's adopting more libertarian philosophies, and that's a good thing. We're all going to be better for it. It's MAGA versus the machine. So what that means is you've got to step your game up. You can't come soft. In 2016, they were chanting "Build the Wall." I do have MAGA versus machine merch. I'll have it in the description. It started with "Build the Wall." You remember the chants, the "Build the Wall" chants were woo. They were hype when they said that. Me, I was kind of like, maybe there's better ways we can do it, or I wasn't against it. I just didn't think it was sophisticated enough. But it rallied people. Now, fast forward, 2020 happens. We are in 2022. Steve Bannon says, we are going to change from "build the wall" to "end the Fed." That's how MAGA goes up against the machine. It can't be the same way that it was done in 2016. Bannon, closing out his speech at CPAC Dallas 2022, August 7th. He closed it out like this.
One last thing. The biggest scam they have, the biggest con, is not just the appropriations process and how they fund it. It's the Federal Reserve. Okay? Okay? Zero.
Ooh, that was a do they call it a spattering or splattering, or that was a mediocre applause. And I'm fine with that because Steve Bannon is bringing, this is something I haven't dug into until recently. He's bringing knowledge to people who don't know what he's even really talking about. He's talking about the Federal Reserve. And I'll do a separate video to try to dig into what it is, because it is kind of complicated to tackle. Literally, how is money made? They just create it out of thin air. It's digital now. But basically, the best way to describe this is you're playing a game of Monopoly and you don't run out of money. It's impossible to run out of money. That's what's happening. If the bank runs out of money, then the bank literally just gives you a piece of paper, and that's what our currency is. It's not, I barely touch money anymore. My 5-year-old kid touched money, and he was like kind of ripping it up and playing it up. And we're like, wait, is that money? What are you doing? He never really even touched money that often. It's basically like handing out a piece of paper and saying it's an IOU. And you can't run out of it. You can just keep on printing it. So you can imagine if you can keep on printing it, it's not worth anything. That's what Steve Bannon is bringing. He's bringing some knowledge. He is not a libertarian. Let's be clear. He is authoritarian, right? But constitutionalist. So it's not like he's going to be like Biden trying to fire innocent citizens. But what he will do is go all the way up and maybe cross the line a little bit is what he would want to do to maintain power. I'm obviously way closer on the side of Steve Bannon than I would be Joe Biden. But this is a libertarian philosophy that he's talking about, or topic, I should say.
The biggest scam they have, the biggest con, is not just the appropriations process and how they fund it. It's the Federal Reserve. Okay? Okay? 0.5% of the citizens of this country own more assets than the bottom 90%. That's all happened over the last.
Do you want to know why so many Bernie bros said You must be crazy if you think I'm voting for Hillary Clinton. And they voted Trump in 2016 and 2020. A significant portion of Bernie Sanders supporters went over to Donald Trump. Why? Because Donald Trump doesn't get into all this. They know behind Donald Trump is Steve Bannon and others who are populists who will talk about stuff like this. Bannon wasn't talking about ending the Fed, but he was back in 2016 talking about disparities in wealth. And this resonates with a lot of people.
They fund it. It's the Federal Reserve. Okay? Okay? 0.5% of the citizens of this country own more assets than the bottom 90%. That's all happened over the last 10 years since 2008. We took a monetary base of back in the 80s of $800 billion. The balance sheet of the Fed was $880 billion under President Bush.
I was looking back at the history of inflation. There was no cumulative inflation from when the first boats came here to 1913. The money wasn't devalued. 1913 comes. This is Woodrow Wilson does the Federal Reserve Act, creates the Federal Reserve. They say it's not a private bank, but in my opinion, it is a private bank. They just start printing money. And when you print money, you're at the beginning of the source. You take it, you divvy it out to your friends. That's the equity firms and others. And then everybody else gets a little bit at the end. But when you do that, all of the money gets devalued. But if you're right at the spout where they create the money, you always are going to have the majority of the funds. So inflation doesn't really bother you. It bothers you more when you're closer to the middle or the bottom of that totem pole. Why do you think MAGA is so culturally diverse? Why do you think? Because it represents everyone who's downstream. Democrat Party has become the party of elites. When you've got the more money you have, the less inflation hurts you. It's easier to make adjustments.
Right? Balance sheet of the Fed is $9.5 trillion today. The debt's $30 trillion. We have $100 to $150 trillion of contingent liabilities. All just because we're the prime reserve currency. The greatest export we have is the dollar. But all of that rests on the shoulders of our children and our grandchildren. Those are all due bills that are come due. All we've done is we've just cranked everything up. That's why they're talking about these ridiculous, insane bills of trillions of dollars, because the Federal Reserve will print the money. The Federal Reserve, by the way,
we don't have the money. Think about that. We don't have the money for these bills. And it just keeps getting passed on and passed on. Oh, nothing's happened. Nothing's happened. Passed on, passed on. No, nothing's happened. Nothing's happened. Passed on, passed on. We are reaching a point here. I don't know when. I don't know if it's within 2 years or 10 years. It will be in our lifetime. I am very confident of that. The whole system, the whole deck of cards will collapse. At some point, that will happen. Why the feds have to keep increasing the interest rates, because the interest rates have to be higher than inflation if you want to stop inflation. There's other ways, exporting goods. Basically, the opposite of everything they did in the Inflation Reduction Act is what you would want to do to reduce inflation.
Owned not by the American people, a central bank that's owned by 24 prime brokers, being J.P. Morgan and Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley. How does that work? And governors that kind of selected, but 12 years. And the best governor we've had in the Federal Reserve right here in Dallas, Richard Fisher, who told you what was going to happen by going to negative interest rates, told you what was going to happen by printing all this money and having $4, $5, $6 trillion, $7 trillion, $8 trillion, now $9 trillion in the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve. It's going to cause, you talk inequality, it's not a $15 minimum wage, that's tip money. We have, I think M2 today is 22 or $23 trillion. That's how the administrative state pays for itself. We don't need to audit the Fed. We need to end the Federal Reserve.
Woo, at CPAC, Steve Bannon is former Goldman Sachs. And some people use that against him. Maybe, and that's fine if you don't trust him. I think it could be a reason to not trust him. But for me, I think he understands how these things work better than a lot of people. It's also former intelligence. That's another way you can not trust him. That's another way you can maybe look at him and say, maybe he knows a little bit more. But for him to say this at CPAC and the Fed, can you believe that? It'd be like Ron Paul back in the day.
The Federal Reserve has usurped its power and the power of the American people and our elected representatives. And no, they do not have the consent of the governed. We will not comply. We will not submit, and it must be ended.
Woo-wee. At CPAC. This happened at CPAC. This isn't AFPAC. I mean, this is CPAC that he's saying this. You want to know why Steve Bannon is the real reason he's banned from Twitter, banned from YouTube? It's because he says stuff like this, and a lot of people come to listen.
In closing, let me just remind you, from the founding of this nation up to the founding of the Federal Reserve, for those 100 years, Hamilton versus Jefferson, Andrew Jackson, Abraham Lincoln, Henry Clay, Teddy Roosevelt, William Jennings Bryan, the whole concept of 19th century is almost entirely the politics of money. It was actively debated what the currency was. Who controlled the currency? What was a central bank? Who controlled the central bank? After the Federal Reserve was formed, we've lost that. That is going to be one of the, if not the most major issue we have. We have to end the Federal Reserve. We have to turn it back. That central bank is going to be owned by one group. You know what that group is? The American people. The American people. Not a bunch of fat cat prime brokers on Wall Street. Not third-tier bankers from fifth-tier firms like Powell. You're going to have the American people control their own bank and their own currency.
That was Steve Bannon. Woo. I'm going to end with Ron Paul. Thanks for stopping by. I just wanted to highlight that. And before I go with Ron Paul, what I want to say is this is an opportunity for the Libertarian Party. Thanks for stopping by, Austin. And I'm just brainstorming here. I'm obviously not knocking the Libertarian Party. You can kind of feel there's a but coming. This is the opportunity, but I don't feel like it's been maximized like I would want it to be. I tweeted about it, Comic Dave Smith. Thanks for replying. He replied. He's like, I've been on this. I know you've been. I'm not saying that they're better than you. I'm saying you can communicate this better than anyone. And I don't know what that looks like, but somehow Libertarian Party's got to jump in here and ride. Steve Bannon has a crowd of people at CPAC yelling in support for EndtheFEd. Steve Bannon was on, I think it was on his show or with Postvec or somebody, and I heard him, he was on with Charlie Kirk. And I heard him say, EndtheFEd is the new build the wall. MAGA's graduating. And I don't know what it looks like, Libertarian Party. My thing is, this is an opportunity. And to me, it seems like it's not over. The window is not over. But it seems like if it's not used to convert or to open up some of those, you heard that crowd barely applaud when he said he was talking about the Federal Reserve. I think a lot of them were maybe like, ooh, that's a little radical, or that's a time for the Libertarian Party to come in and really show, hey, this is what we're about. Let me play this clip here. This is Ron Paul, and I'll be out.
I think your point about eventually about having the monetary reform is good, and we're moving in that direction. It will be unnecessary, and actually history's on our side. This isn't the first time people have done this. I think it's the biggest bubble that has ever occurred with fiat money ever in the history of the world, and therefore it's going to be a big problem. But it happens frequently over the many hundreds of years, if that's not thousands of years. History shows that eventually to get confidence back in the currency is that commodity convertibility.
Fiat money, if you're not familiar, fiat money is basically money that's not backed by anything. You know, typically gold or usually like if you print back before this happened, before Nixon took us off of that, we had a standard where, I forget the exact rate, but $1 equaled so many ounces of gold. So holding the dollar literally meant you were holding gold. They went away from that. It's not backed by anything. It's just a IOU. It's just the whole system's based on faith. That's fiat currency. And if you build a system based on faith, then you can just print money as much as you want. If you had to secure in Fort Knox or wherever a certain amount of gold for each dollar you printed, then you would have a hard time passing bills like we do now. No one's ever stopped it. Trump was a part of it. I don't blame Trump, because Trump was like, in my opinion, Trump's like, well, I don't get any credit if I'm not spending money. And spending money kind of makes people happy, and I can maintain power. That's a logical way that's why everybody still does it in DC. There's no benefit for the person that goes to DC and says, let's stop this. That's why it's very important to see Steve Bannon talking about this.
Ability is a necessity, and that's essentially what we've been talking about here. Subprime, everything is subprime when the Fed dictates interest rates at 0 or 1%, when the market would have been 3, 4, or 5%. Besides, it's a moral issue. They're stealing. It's theft. They're destroying the whole principle of frugality. Save and take care of yourself. Save for a rainy day. Save to send your kids to college. They destroy that. They want you to be totally dependent on the government. And that has happened. Now that we're dependent, the government's not going to be able to afford to come through and take care of the needs of the people. It's an important message, and we're going to keep working on promoting that message to understand it so that we can come up with the best correction.
Ron Paul. And then now you hear Steve Bannon saying that. So good, so good. Let me just play a couple more of these clips. You know, I'm out, but let me just play these clips. It's just so good.
I think your point about eventually about having the monetary reform is good, and we're moving in that direction. It will be unnecessary, and actually history's on our side. This isn't the first time people have done this. I think it's the biggest bubble that has ever occurred with fiat money ever in the history of the world, and therefore it's going to be a big problem. But it happens frequently over the many hundreds of years, if that's not thousands of years. History shows that eventually to get confidence back in the currency is that commodity convertibility is a necessity, and that's essentially...
That's what Russia did with the ruble. They backed it with gold. They went old school.
What we've been talking about here, subprime, everything is subprime when the Fed dictates interest rates at 0 or 1%, when the market would have been 3, 4, or 5%. Besides, it's a moral issue. They're stealing. It's theft. They're destroying the whole principle of frugality. Save and take care of yourself. Save for a rainy day. Save to send your kids to college. They destroy that. They want you to be totally dependent on the government. And that has happened. Now that we're dependent, the government's not going to be able to afford to come through and take care of the needs of the people. It's an important message, and we're going to keep working on promoting that message to understand it so that we can come up with the best correction. I want to talk about the Fed today, again, and we will continue to talk about the Fed, I think, for a long time until we get rid of it. and or till it self-destructs and they become insignificant. And the latter is probably more likely to happen before we get a vote in the Congress to change the monetary policy. And I think that I feel like the job we have on our program here is to emphasize this, because the crisis is coming, and the more people who can understand this, the better chance we have in the reforms that'll be necessary, and why you have to have sound money, and why you can't depend and take and listen to Yellen and say, oh, the problem is we need more regulations. If we'd only have regulations, we can fix all the mistakes. We have a wonderful Fed doing what they need to do, but the market messes it up, and we need just regulations to make sure no mistakes are made. Well, I tell you, that's going to end, and we have to convince the American people of that, so that they will understand that, you know, when the crunch comes, it wasn't because of too little government and not enough regulation. It came because there was way too much government, and that they thought the role of government there was to take care of people from cradle to grave and police the world. But we will have that opportunity. Hopefully it's a distant time off, but it'll be coming sooner than we expect.